In neuroscience laboratory at the University of Wisconsin, sometime around 2007, a monk sat in a chair with 64 electrodes glued to his scalp. He had been meditating for over 30,000 hours across his lifetime. The researchers had studied experienced practitioners before. They expected to see a familiar pattern: heightened gamma waves, increased prefrontal activity, the signature of a well-trained mind. Doing what well-trained minds do, they asked him to focus, to pick a single object, his breath, and hold his attention there. And the brainwaves did exactly what they expected. A clean, focused signal. The prefrontal cortex lighting up like a spotlight, aimed at one point. Then they asked him to do something else. They said, stop focusing. Instead, just be aware. Don't concentrate on anything. Let your mind become open, receptive, watching everything without grabbing anything. And the monk's brain did something the researchers had not seen before. A completely different neural signature. Not focused, not scattered. Something else entirely. A wide, panoramic quality of attention that activated brain regions they did not associate with meditation at all. 2 instructions, 2 patterns from the same mind, in the same chair, minutes apart. We will come back to that laboratory. But not yet. Here is what matters right now. This year, somewhere around 10 million people will download a meditation app. They will sit for 10 minutes with their eyes closed. A calm voice will tell them to notice their breath, observe their thoughts, return their attention when it wanders. And when they finish, the app will say, "Great job meditating." But here is the thing most of them will never hear. What they just did, that noticing, that returning, that bare awareness of what is happening. The Buddha had a word for it. He called it Sati, Saishti, and it is not the same thing as meditation. The Buddha also taught meditation. He had a different word for that too. He called it Jhāna. Jhāna and Jhāna is something else entirely. A deep, formal, sustained practice of concentration that most people who use meditation apps have never experienced and may never experience if no one tells them it exists. Sati and Jhāna, 2 words, 2 practices, 2 completely different things. The Buddha taught for 2 completely different reasons. And somewhere in the last 50 years, the English-speaking world took both of them and collapsed them into a single word, mindfulness. And then stuck that word on an app and sold it for $12 a month. This is not a video about relaxation. This is not a video about clearing your mind. This is not a video about becoming a calmer person. This is about a distinction that the Buddha made 2,500 years ago. A distinction that modern neuroscience has independently confirmed, and that the entire wellness industry has quietly erased. By the end, you will know the difference, and it will change how you practice to understand how we got here, how 2 different practices became one blurry word. You have to go back to the source, not to a meditation retreat in California, not to a wellness podcast, to a forest in northern India 2,500 years ago, where a man sat surrounded by a small group of monks, said something that would be remembered word for centuries. The discourse is called the Satipaṭṭhāna, Sutta. It is one of the most important texts in the entire Pali Canon. And the first thing you notice, if you actually read it, is what it does not say. It does not say, sit down. It does not say, close your eyes. It does not say, find a quiet room. What it says is this: a monk lives contemplating the body as body, contemplating feelings as feelings, contemplating mind as mind, contemplating mental objects as mental objects, ardent, clearly comprehending, mindful, having put away covetousness and grief for the world. That word, mindful, is the English translation of Sati. And Sati, in the original Pali, meant something closer to remembering. Not remembering the past, remembering to pay attention, remembering to notice what is happening right now, in this body, in this mind, in this moment, before the habits take over. Pay attention to this. The Buddha described Sati as something you do while walking, while standing, while sitting, while lying down, while eating, while drinking, while chewing, while tasting. He was explicit. He listed the activities one by one, as if he knew that 25 centuries later, someone would try to limit this practice to a cushion. Sati is not a technique you perform for 10 minutes. Sati is a quality you carry. The way your eyes carry sight, you do not turn sight on and off. You do not schedule it. It is always available. The only question is whether you are using it, or whether you have forgotten. And Nanda, the Buddha's closest attendant for 25 years, once asked him a question that cuts to the heart of this. Ananda had a gift. He remembered everything, every discourse, every teaching, every conversation. He was, in a sense, the living recording device of early Buddhism, and at one point he said to the Buddha something like, "Is mindfulness really that important? Is it really the foundation of the entire path?" And the Buddha's answer, preserved in the Samyutta Nikaya, was essentially, yes, Sati is the one quality that is always useful, in every situation, at every stage of the path. There is no moment when mindfulness is not beneficial. Now hold that thought, because the Buddha also taught something else. Something that looks like mindfulness from the outside, but operates completely differently on the inside. Jhāna. If Sati is the wide-open awareness you bring to every moment of your life, Jhāna is the opposite architecture. Jhāna is narrow. Jhāna is deep. Jhāna is what happens when you take your attention, all of it, and aim it at a single object and hold it there until the mind changes state. The night of the Buddha's awakening, the night under the Bodhi tree that every Buddhist tradition treats as the turning point of human history. What was he doing? He was not practicing Sati. He was practicing Jhāna. He entered the first Jhāna, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, progressive stages of absorption, each one deeper, each one quieter, each one further from the surface noise of ordinary consciousness. The Pali Canon describes these stages with remarkable precision. The first jhana still has thinking in it, applied thought, and sustained thought, the mind actively working to stay on its object. But it also has something ordinary thinking does not have: rapture, a physical, felt sense of energy and pleasure that arises not from anything external, but from the concentration itself. The second jhana drops the thinking. What remains is rapture and pleasure, but without effort. The mind is no longer working to concentrate. It is simply concentrated, like a spring-fed lake. The texts say, the water does not come from outside. It wells up from within. The third jhana releases the rapture. What remains is a deep, steady pleasure and a quality of equanimity. The mind perfectly balanced, perfectly at ease, not leaning toward anything and not pushing anything away. The fourth jhana releases even the pleasure. What remains is pure equanimity and sati, mindfulness, but a mindfulness so refined, so still, that it bears almost no resemblance to what your meditation app means. When it says, notice your breath, you can see the irony. At the deepest level of Jhāna, Sati reappears. The two practices are not enemies. They are partners, but they are not the same thing. A surgeon needs steady hands and sharp eyes. You would not confuse the two. You would not train one and assume you have trained the other. Here is where the story gets complicated. And here is where a man you have probably never heard of changed the entire trajectory of how the world understands Buddhist practice. His name was Buddhaghosa. He lived in Sri Lanka in the 5th century of the Common Era, roughly 1,000 years after the Buddha. And he wrote a book called the Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification, which became the single most influential meditation manual in Theravada Buddhist history. Buddhaghosa was brilliant. He was systematic in a way the suttas are not. He took the Buddha's scattered teachings on jhana and organized them into a precise technical framework. 40 meditation objects, 4 jhana stages, each with exact entry criteria and exit markers. He made meditation legible, teachable, replicable. But in doing so, he did something else. He made jhana seem like a specialist activity, something for monks in caves, something requiring months or years of unbroken silence, something that ordinary people with jobs and children and Tuesday afternoon meetings could not realistically attain. And Sati became the accessible alternative, the practice for everyone, the thing you could do without a cave, without a decade of retreat, without giving up your life. This was not Buddhaghosa's intention, but it was his legacy. And 1,500 years later, when Buddhist meditation reached the West, the split was already built into the system. Jhana was for the specialists. Sati was for everyone else. Stay with me, because what happened next, in the 20th century, is where the confusion became permanent. So, here is where we are. Sati, mindfulness, is the awareness you bring to every moment. Walking, eating, arguing with your partner, sitting in traffic. It is not a technique. It is a quality of attention. The Buddha taught it as something you carry with you, the way you carry your own breathing. Jhana, meditation in the original sense, is something else. A formal, sustained, deep practice of concentration that takes the mind through progressive stages of absorption. It requires conditions. It requires time. It requires the kind of commitment that most modern practitioners have never been told they need. The Buddha taught both. He needed both. And for 1,500 years, Buddhist traditions kept them in relationship. Different practices, different purposes, feeding each other. But somewhere in the 20th century, the English language did something the Pali language never did. It merged them. If this distinction is already shifting how you think about your own practice, if something just clicked that has been quietly bothering you for years, subscribe to Dharma, Made Simple. Every video on this channel goes this deep. Hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Because what happened in the 20th century and who made it happen is a story almost nobody tells properly. In 1949, in the city of Rangoon, a Burmese monk named Mahāsī Sayādaw opened a meditation center that would quietly reshape how the entire Western world understands Buddhist practice. Mahāsī had a problem, and it was a compassionate one. For centuries, serious meditation practice in the Theravada tradition had been the domain of monastics, monks and nuns who had renounced everything. Lay people were expected to support the monasteries, observe the precepts, accumulate merit, and maybe in some future life, they would be born into conditions where real meditation became possible. Mahāsī rejected this. He believed ordinary people, householders, workers' mothers, merchants could practice now. Not in a future life, now. So he developed something remarkable. A simplified technique built around one core instruction: note what is happening. Note sitting, breathing. Note rising, falling. Thinking, note, thinking. Hearing a sound. Note hearing pain in the knee. Note pain, this is pure Sati. Bear attention, labeling experience as it arises, without adding anything, without pushing anything away. Mahāsī's genius was making it accessible. You did not need to master 40 meditation objects. You did not need to enter Jhāna. You needed to notice and name what was already happening. The technique swept through Burma, then Thailand, then Sri Lanka, and then through a chain of teachers and translators and seekers who traveled to Southeast Asia in the 1960s and 70s. It arrived in the West. But here is where the confusion began. Mahāsī's noting technique was a Sati practice, a mindfulness practice. But the centers that taught it called themselves meditation centers. The retreats were called meditation retreats. The teachers were called meditation teachers. Nobody was lying. Nobody was trying to deceive anyone. In the Burmese context, the distinction between Sati and Jhāna was understood implicitly. Everyone knew that noting was one thing, and deep absorption was another. But English does not have that implicit understanding. English has one word: meditation. And it was about to absorb everything. In 1979, a molecular biologist at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center did something audacious. His name was Jon Kabat-Zinn, and he had been practicing Zen and Vipassana for years. He had studied with some of the most important Buddhist teachers. It's of the 20th century. He understood Sati. He understood Jhāna. He understood the difference. And he decided to remove all of it, not the practice. The language Kabat-Zinn took Sati, bare attention, non-judgmental awareness of present moment experience, and stripped away every piece of Buddhist vocabulary. No Pali, no suttas. No Buddha, no robes. He repackaged Sati as a clinical intervention for chronic pain patients, and he called it mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. His definition became one of the most widely cited descriptions of mindfulness in the English language. Paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Read that again. That is a near-perfect description of Sati. It is not a description of Jhāna, not even close. Jhāna is not non-judgmental. Jhāna is not open. Jhāna takes your attention and narrows it to a single point until the mind changes. State. Kabat-Zinn was teaching Sati and calling it mindfulness, which was accurate. The problem is what happened next. Because MBSR worked, the clinical trials were striking. Chronic pain patients improved. Anxiety decreased. The medical establishment paid attention. And within a decade, mindfulness was no longer a Buddhist term translated from Pali. It was a medical term, a psychological term, a wellness term, a corporate training term, a word on the cover of Time magazine, and nobody, not Kabat-Zinn, not the researchers, not the app developers who came later. Nobody clarified that this was only half of what the Buddha taught. Around the same time, another teacher was building something equally influential. S.N. Goenka, born in Burma to an Indian family, began offering 10-day silent Vipassana retreats, free of charge. Worldwide, Goenka's method was different from Mahāsī's. His core technique was body scanning, moving attention systematically through the body, observing sensations moment by moment. Here is what makes Goenka fascinating for this conversation. Body scanning is Sati, awareness of bodily sensation. But sustaining that awareness for 10 hours a day, for 10 consecutive days, in complete silence, that starts to build samadhi, sa-m-h-d. Concentration, deep, sustained, one-pointed concentration, the kind of concentration that, in the Buddha's system, is the foundation of jhana. He knew this. He knew he was weaving sati and samadhi together. He did it deliberately. But he never separated them publicly. He never said to his students, this part of the practice is mindfulness, and this part is concentration. He just said, observe. And his students, millions of them, across every continent, walked away thinking they had learned one practice. They had learned two. They just did not know it. William James, the American psychologist, writing in 1890, described something that sounds remarkably like Sati nearly a century before MBSR existed. He wrote that the ability to voluntarily return a wandering attention over and over is the root of judgment, character, and will. He called it the education of attention. Not concentration, not absorption. Attention, the why. Returning noticing quality, that the Buddha called Sati. James had no access to the Pali Canon. He had never heard the word Sati, but he had identified the same faculty, and he had distinguished it. Intuitively, from the narrower act of concentration, the Buddha made the same distinction. Modern neuroscience has confirmed it. And yet, open your phone right now. Download any meditation app, Headspace, Calm, Insight Timer. 10% happier. Start a session. A gentle voice will ask you to notice your breath, to observe your thoughts, to return your attention when it wanders. That is Sati. That is mindfulness. And it is genuinely valuable. There is nothing wrong with it. But the app will call it meditation, and you will finish your 10 minutes and believe you have meditated. And you will have done something good for your mind. But you will not have done what the Buddha meant when he talked about meditation. You will not have entered Jhāna. You will not have experienced the progressive deepening of concentration that the Pali Canon describes in precise, replicable detail. You will not have touched the second Jhāna, where thinking stops and the mind becomes like a spring-fed lake. You will not know what that feels like, not because you cannot, but because nobody told you it was there. And this is where the story turns. Let me take you back to Wisconsin. The laboratory belongs to Richard Davidson's son, a neuroscientist who has spent decades studying what happens inside the brains of people who meditate, not casually, not with apps. People who have spent 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 hours in formal practice. Monks, nuns, long-term retreat practitioners. People who have given significant portions of their lives to training the mind. Davidson's team had been imaging the brains of experienced meditators for years. They knew what focused attention looked like on a scan. Prefrontal cortex activation, heightened gamma wave synchrony. A brain that had learned to aim itself like a spotlight and hold steady. This is the neural signature of what the Pali Canon calls samatha. Calm, concentrated, one-pointed attention. The doorway to jhana. But then they asked a question that changed the direction of the research. What happens when you ask the same person to stop focusing and instead simply be aware? Not aware of one thing, aware of everything. The sounds in the room, the temperature of the air, the sensations in the body, the quality of the light. Not grabbing any of it, not holding any of it, just knowing, the way a mirror knows what is in front of it without reaching out to touch it. And the brain did something different. The prefrontal spotlight dimmed. In its place, a wider network activated. Regions associated with sensory integration, with peripheral awareness, with what the researchers began to call open monitoring. The brain was not focused. It was not distracted either. It was receptive, panoramic, taking in the full field of experience without narrowing onto any single object. Two instructions, two completely different neural architectures, from the same brain, in the same chair, minutes apart. Davidson's team published their findings and introduced a distinction that the neuroscience community had never formally made. They called the first practice focused attention. Meditation. They called the second open monitoring meditation. Two categories. Two measurable, replicable, neurologically distinct processes. Here is what struck me when I first encountered this research. Davidson did not know, or perhaps he did, but the papers do not say it explicitly, that he had just rediscovered, with functional MRI machines and electrode arrays, a distinction that a man sitting under a fig tree had articulated 25 centuries earlier. Focused attention is samatha, the concentration practice. The path to jhāna. Open monitoring is sati. Mindfulness, bare attention. The quality the Buddha described in the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta. Watching the body, the feelings, the mind, the mental objects, without clinging and without aversion. The Buddha did not have an EEG. He did not need one. He mapped the territory of the mind through direct observation, his own and his students. And he came to the same conclusion that Davidson's laboratory reached with millions of dollars of equipment. These are two different things. They use different muscles. They produce different results. And you need both. Now, why does this matter to you? Not to a monk, not to a neuroscientist. To you, sitting wherever you are right now, living the life you are actually living. It matters because of Tuesday, not a special Tuesday, an ordinary one. You wake up, you check your phone. There are 11 emails, and 2 of them make your stomach tighten. You get dressed. You drive to work or sit down at your desk. Your boss says something that lands wrong. A colleague takes credit for your idea. Your child calls from school with a problem you cannot solve from where you are sitting. By 3 in the afternoon, you are running on caffeine and irritation and a low hum of anxiety that you could not name even if someone asked you to. This is where sati lives. Sati is the capacity to notice, in that moment, at 3 in the afternoon, between the coffee and the email, that you are angry. Not to fix the anger, not to breathe it away, not to judge yourself for having it, just to know, oh, this is anger. It is here. It is in my jaw and my shoulders. And the tight heat behind my eyes, it is here. I see it. That seeing, that bare, non-reactive knowing, is what the Buddha meant by sati. And it is available to you right now, not after a retreat, not after 10,000 hours. Now, you do not need silence. You do not need a cushion. You need the remembering. The remembering to look. But here is what sati cannot do alone. Sati can show you the anger. It cannot give you the steadiness to stay with it. Sati can reveal the craving. It cannot give you the composure to not act on it. Sati is the light. But the light flickers if the mind is untrained. This is what jhāna is for. Jhāna is the training. The formal, sustained, deep work of concentration that builds the mind's capacity to stay, to hold, to not be pushed around by every impulse, every sensation, every thought that passes through. When you sit down, not for 10 minutes with an app, but for 30 or 40 or 60 minutes with nothing but your breath and your intention. And you hold your attention on one object until the restlessness quiets and the boredom passes and something deeper opens. That is the beginning of jhāna. And the steadiness you build in that practice does not stay on the cushion. It follows you into Tuesday. The monk in Davidson's lab could switch between two modes of attention because he had trained both. He had spent years building the focused concentration of samatha, and he had spent years cultivating the open awareness of sati. The two practices had shaped his brain in two different ways, and together, they produced something neither could produce alone. The Buddha said the same thing in the Yuganadha Sutta, the discourse on the paired practice. The teaching is explicit: samatha and vipassana. Vipassana, calm and insight; concentration and awareness. Developed in tandem, yoked together like two oxen pulling the same cart. One without the other, and the cart turns in circles. The modern mindfulness industry has given millions of people one ox, and that ox is strong. That ox is valuable. Sati, bare attention. Present moment awareness. The noting practice. The body scan, the 10-minute morning session. This is real practice. It changes lives. The clinical evidence is overwhelming, but it is one ox, and somewhere in a corner of the tradition, that the apps and the corporate workshops and the wellness podcasts have not reached. The other ox is waiting jhāna, the deep practice, the concentration that the Buddha himself relied on the night he sat under the Bodhi tree and did not stand up until he understood you do not have to choose one. The Buddha never asked you to. He taught sati for your whole life and jhāna for your formal practice. He taught awareness for Tuesday and concentration for Saturday morning. He taught the light and the strength to hold it steady. The question is whether anyone has told you that both exist, and now someone has. So let me leave you with three things. First, sati and jhāna are not the same practice. They never were. They have different Pali words, different instructions, different purposes, and, as Richard Davidson's laboratory has shown, different neural signatures. When someone says mindfulness meditation, as if it is one thing, they are compressing a distinction the Buddha considered essential. Sati is the quality of bare, open, non-reactive awareness. Jhāna is the practice of deep, sustained, single-pointed concentration. You can practice sati while washing dishes. You cannot practice jhāna while washing dishes. That is not a flaw in either one. It is the design. Second, if your entire practice right now is 10 minutes a day with a guided app, you are almost certainly practicing sati. And that is good. Do not stop sati is what keeps you from sending the email you will regret. Sati is what lets you feel the grief without drowning in it. Sati is what the Buddha called the one quality that is always beneficial. In every situation, at every stage of the path. But consider adding something. One session a week, maybe on a Saturday morning, maybe on a Sunday night, 30 minutes, no app, no guided voice, no background music, just you and the breath. Set a timer, sit. Hold your attention on the sensation of breathing at the nostrils. One point, one object, And when the mind wanders, bring it back, not with frustration, with patience, again and again and again. That is not mindfulness. That is the beginning of concentration, and the stability you build there will make every other moment of your week sharper, steadier, more clear. Third, the Buddha did not teach Sati so you could feel calm. He did not teach Jhāna so you could escape your life. He taught Sati so you could see what is actually happening in your body, in your mind, in the space between a trigger and your reaction. And he taught Jhāna so your mind would be strong enough to bear what it sees. Because seeing clearly is not always comfortable. Watching anger without acting on it is hard. Sitting with grief and not running from it is hard. Noticing that the thing you want most in the world will not last. That the person you love is impermanent. That this body is impermanent. That this moment is already gone. That is not relaxation. That takes strength. Sati gives you the seeing. Jhāna gives you the strength. One without the other is half the path. The Pali Canon preserves a line from the Dhammapada that says, "The mind is the forerunner of all states." What you think you become, though not in the way the internet memes mean it. What the Buddha meant is simpler and harder. The quality of your attention shapes the quality of your life. Every moment you spend noticing, really noticing, what is happening inside you, you are practicing Sati. Every moment you spend training the mind to stay, to hold, to not be scattered by the next notification, or the next worry, or the next craving. You are building the foundation of Jhāna. You do not need to become a monk. You do not need to go to Burma. You do not need 30,000 hours. You need to know that these are two different practices. And now you do. Which one have you been practicing without realizing it? Sati or Jhāna? And has anything in this video changed how you think about your own practice? Tell me in the comments. If this gave you a distinction you have not heard before, like and subscribe to Dharma Made Simple and share it with someone who has been practicing for years and might never have been told the difference. Hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next.